Welcome everybody to a brand new year of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and welcome to 2025. We are now entering the 6th year of this podcast, and I'm so excited for all the possibilities and for all the future guests that are going to come on this podcast to share their stories. And before we get into today's guest, I want to make sure I remind folks to subscribe to YouTube. Hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. Also, if you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other audio platform, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who would like to donate towards the podcast, you can do it through 3 channels. There is Cash App with the handle $IDTALK4ED, Venmo with the handle @Kwame SM, and then PayPal with the URL paypal.me/Kwame SM. Either of these 3 channels will allow you to make a donation towards the podcast, and I thank you for the support. And then for those who have been with Identity Talk for Educators Live from day one and all other things Identity Talk, you could join the community on Patreon, become a patron today so you can get behind the scenes content as well as some perks for being such a dedicated fan, a dedicated member of the community. So make sure you go to Patreon and join there today. And then, of course, to catch past and future episodes of the podcast, you can go to the main website at identitytalk4educators.com. And then, of course, my book, Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culture-Affirming Classroom, has been out for a couple months now. And I just want to thank all those who have purchased a copy, all those who have shared about the book with their friends and colleagues, all those who have left reviews about the book, whether through social media or on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, any of those other platforms. I appreciate every bit of support. I don't take it for granted at all. And if you are somebody who still hasn't purchased a copy, don't worry. We still have lots of copies available. You can go to the Routledge website where you can get it directly from our publisher. You could also go to Amazon and any other book retailers online. And then, of course, if you love what you read, make sure you leave a 5-star review on Amazon. That is if I earned it. So please, any support helps. You could also go to learntorelearn.com to check out more information about the book, the chapters, and other resources that you can use in your classroom. So once again, thank you all for the support. All right, now that we got that out the way, let's get to the conversation. This guest that we have today is somebody who is an open book. She is unapologetic about who she is. She is someone who I've had a chance to follow on social media for a while, and every time she puts a post out, I find myself either unlearning something or learning something new or interrogating something that either I've done or other folks have done. She's that thought-provoking, and she has done so much in the international school space. There isn't one word to describe what she does, but she's going to be the one to let us know exactly who she is, how she shows up, and why she shows up the way she does. So without further ado, I want to bring on Katrina Daniels-Samasa to the podcast to talk with us about her story, her family, her career, and everything else in between. So let's bring Katrina on. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Hey, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm so glad we could finally schedule a time. I think we've been back and forth for a minute, as we say.
Yeah, but we finally here, and that's the most important thing. where
Absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
all that matters. So first off, thank you for coming on and for taking some time to share a little bit about your story. So typically when I start this podcast, I always like a basic question. Maybe it's not so basic for you, but for others, maybe. But I'll find out. So you're an educator, among many other things you do. So who or what inspire you to want to do the work that you do as an educator?
Okay, so this is a very interesting question for me because I just had this conversation recently. And um, part of it, I think part of my answer is inspirational. And I think part of it is also might not be so inspirational. I was raised in Detroit. I was raised in inner city Detroit. And it's very interesting where I was raised. I was raised very close to, or part of where I was raised, very close to Motown Studios. And if you know where Motown Studios is located, you know there's one side and the street is called Linwood, actually. And one side of Linwood is poverty, and the other side is literally you will run into $1 million homes. And so that is where I was raised. Not really, unfortunately, but fortunately, I had great educators. Who encouraged me. I was labeled as gifted. And so they inspired me to educate, right? They were like, hey, you could be a teacher, you could do inspire children the way that I'm inspiring you. Not in those terms, but really cultivating what I could be. I was from a divorce, my mother was divorced, 3 children, single mother home. And so, ironically, my favorite teacher also taught my mother and could see the difference in us as students. And so, really, she was inspirational. On the other hand, I think as a gifted child, there was limited exposure to anything beyond teacher, doctor, lawyer. And so while I think being an educator has been a wonderful experience, I always question or make sure that when I'm talking to students or when I was teaching, I didn't limit them with what I thought they could be, but actually ask them about the dreams they had so that I could help them facilitate what they wanted to be. I always wonder if I was given a wider scope what other things I could be. But as you said, I do everything. So, I'm thankful to the great educators out there, and I absolutely love what I do. But it's also been a learning journey for me to make sure that I'm opening many doors in multi-dimensional ways. So that's kind of my answer.
I appreciate that. And of course, here on this show, we always like to dive into identity and unpack. So I want to take us back to your K-12 experience. And I'm wondering, from your side of things, did you ever experience any struggles, any hardships as far as embracing your full self, not just in school, but maybe other spaces you were in?
I think this is a very important question. And I think a lot of people may focus and hone in. I mean, your question talks about K through 12 schooling. And I can say this I lived in Detroit at a time where Detroit was bustling. I mean, it had kind of this roller coaster ish ride, but I was inspired by all the people around me. They looked like me, right? And so I didn't when I went to school, I always tell people, and it's funny because my international friends are like, what? And even some of my non-black friends or people who weren't raised in Detroit, there was in my entire through 12 experience, there was one white student throughout my entire K through 12 experience that I interacted with. So I don't know. It was okay. I'm going to be authentic. It was black. It was blackety black, black. It was
Yeah.
all things black, right? And so my identity was that, being proud, of being who I was, and all of the great teachers that I had, and all of the, the people at church. I went to a church that had a mixed socioeconomic status. So it was beautiful for me. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about being labeled gifted, because my experiences in education was different from my siblings because of that label. And so because of that particular label in Detroit, I was taken out of the inner city at times and exposed to other things that my siblings may not have been exposed to. But my identity was shaped by so many rich and valuable experiences. At the same time, just like I answered before, it was limiting. So when I went to Michigan State University and I realized that America was not 80% Black like Detroit, it was a slap in the face. And not in terms of a slap in the face that hurts, but it was shocking. I didn't know the diversity of America. And so when I initially went into a classroom being gifted, and having all of those beautiful experiences, there was still a sense of intimidation because I had never been around an environment where I was outnumbered. And so I never saw myself as a minority numerically until I went to Michigan State University. So it was really reconciliation for me, reconciliation with reality, because the reality was the world was not America, not the world, but America was not majority Black. And so I had to learn how to navigate these spaces and navigate them, understanding the stereotypes that had come out of Detroit, and all the things that people had told me about different races and people, and discover, are these things true, or are they stereotypes? And why are people saying what they're saying about certain people and certain demographics? And being okay with my great grandfather and my grandfather's experiences, being okay with they didn't necessarily have to be my experiences, but also carrying those experiences on my back. So it was really interesting. It was beautiful, but again, everything is a learning journey. So once I went to Michigan State, I was like, oh, okay. And it was really about, how can I continue to be my blackety black and be okay self and navigate these different demographics without not being who I am, right? And so that was a learning point for me. So
All
that's my
right. Well,
identity.
of course. I mean, you say Michigan State, so it's only right that I say go Spartans, number
Go
one.
green.
Go green.
Yes.
And then, were you there around the same time as our mutual friend? Shout out to Kevin. Found
Yeah,
at
of course.
A-Lot.
Yes.
Y'all were there.
Yes.
Okay, y'all were there around the same time. Okay.
We were there. So interestingly enough, Kevin and I know a lot of the same people, and I was actually married and a mother. So we knew a lot of the same people and the same places and spaces, but we didn't know each other at the time, because by the time, I think, yeah, there was a part of my journey where I got married and had children. And so I couldn't do all the undergrad stuff that most people were doing at the time. But yeah, we have history. Not knowing each other, but yeah, stories. We have shared
Yeah.
stories.
But if you don't mind me asking, because I'm thinking about your own story. I mean, you were only 21 when you got married.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about how I was at 21. I was not thinking about being tied down at that age. So I'm just curious, what got you to want to be tied down or to tie the knot around that time?
Mhm. I think again, I'm very transparent and honest, and I was raised extremely religious, extremely religious. And so if you were raised in Christianity, and this kind of there's a scripture that said it's better to marry than to burn, and I'll just leave it at that. And so
Right. That's right. I feel you.
whether right or wrong, that's why I did get married. Was I ready? Absolutely not. It's clear because we didn't stay married. But again, everything that has happened to me helped shape and form who I am today. My ex-husband is from Cameroon, and it was my first trip abroad in my 20s. I went to France. I went to Cameroon. I did a lot of the things. I learned Cameroonian culture to the point where people thought I was Cameroonian. And so again, it's everything that has happened in my life has prepared me for where I am today. So shout out to Salvador and all the things that I learned from him. He was a bit older and a lot more mature. I was 21. So, again, everything is a learning, and it's really helped my interactions with him and being abroad and broadening my horizons through being with him helps who I am today. So, not a bad thing. It's something that, 20, you do things in your 20s and you look back and you're like, well, that was interesting.
Yeah, well, with every experience, you take away the lessons.
Absolutely.
Firmly believe that.
Absolutely.
Take the lessons away.
Yeah.
So you mentioned doing the study abroad program while at MSU, but eventually you did go abroad and you were at a few countries during that time. So I'm wondering, was the time at MSU the motivator that led you to say, I want to go ahead and actually start teaching career abroad? How do we get there?
Yeah. So I actually didn't study abroad. I just traveled.
Okay.
Again, yeah, with the month-long stints. I did a month-long stint in Cameroon with my ex-husband. I did a few month-long stints well, no, I did a couple weeks in France, and then through being part of the Cameroonian community, there were people who became my family. So even after we divorced, I started traveling to where they live. So Belgium is another home of mine, and I've spent several month-long stints there. But that is actually not what propels me to want to move abroad. It was an inspiration, and I learned French by ear, and I was like, yep, I am going to move to a francophone country. But as I I had children, and I understood that you can't just pop into a new country, right? What actually inspired me was a good friend of mine, Lakaya. We worked in the same place. And it was very interesting because you worked in America, and some public school systems can be quite difficult to navigate. And so we were in a school, the parents weren't difficult, the students weren't difficult, but the leadership was difficult. And so a lot of really, really high turnover. And so Lakaya left our particular school, and someone came to me and said, you like to travel a lot. And I said, yeah. Do you know where Lakaya went? And I said, well, no, I don't. And they said, well, she's in the UAE. Would you be interested in that? And I was like, maybe. So I communicated with her, and it sounded like something I wanted to do. And I did it. I did pack my children up, and we moved abroad. And I wasn't the only one from that school, which was very interesting. It ended up being 3 or 4 of us who left. And so that was my open door into moving abroad. I think traveling before and doing all that travel, and also being in a lot of West African communities, because of the French, I was able to navigate I had Senegalese friends and Malian friends and Guinean friends and friends from Chad and Congo before I even left the US. And so I think being in a lot of those communities, and the beauty is I could navigate those communities as a Black American. And so there were no country boundaries for me. If I went with my Senegalese friends, it wasn't like, oh, she's from Guinea. So there was none of that for me. And so I was able to do that and then translate that kind of cultural interaction into moving abroad. And so, yeah, That's how I ended up abroad. And I wish I would have done it earlier in life. I wish I would have been exposed to the ability for us to move abroad much, much earlier. But everything prepares you for right now. So it is what
Yeah,
it is, right?
the Identity Talk for Educators Live podcast is just one piece of the work that we do under Identity Talk Consulting, which we've had since 2019. And since then, we've had the privilege of working with 40 different schools, districts, and organizations across the globe. And we want to continue to add to that number in this new year. So if you are a school, if you're an educator or an organization that's looking to receive professional development and consulting services within any of our pillars, whether it's anti-bias, anti-racist practices, culturally responsive teaching, or identity affirming education, we are the firm for you, and we love to learn more about your needs. When you have a chance, make sure you go to our website at identitytalk4educators.com to learn more about our services and to schedule a discovery call today. We love to hear from you. C'est la vie, right?
Yes, c'est
C'est
la
la
vie,
vie.
c'est la vie.
Yeah. So I've been working my Duolingo, 150-day streak. So yeah, so just talking about being abroad, I'm sitting here with a trendsetter. So when I first moved abroad, I didn't really have any idea of what that experience would be like. I mean, I did live in Ghana for 3 years as a kid, but now being back abroad as an adult with a family, wife, kids, it's a totally different experience. So I know there are a lot of different Black expat groups that are out right now, but you started the original group,
The first.
Black Americans Living Abroad, the first
Yeah.
group of that kind. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about what led you to even create the group and how did that help redefine your perspective of home, given how
Absolutely.
transient this lifestyle is that we live.
It is. It's so interesting. So before we started recording, of course, we talked about how I have these kind of categories for people who know me because I've lived in all of these different countries, and
Right.
so the people who know me in the education sphere don't know the Black American living abroad sphere, not on purpose, but they don't know. And the BALA sphere doesn't really know the education sphere. And so it's going to be interesting to see these intersect because they're going to have to, which is fine. So I created Black Americans Living Abroad in 2011 because I realized even in my travels when I was in Cameroon, that when I landed in Cameroon, no matter how I dressed, I could get the tailored creations from the Cameroonian tailor, and I could braid my hair just like my Cameroonian brothers and sisters. But there was something about me that was not Cameroonian, and it's the thing, right? And Americans, it's the swag, right? Where everybody has their own kind of swag, right? And I don't
Right.
have the Cameroonian swag. And so people immediately, before I open my mouth, a lot of times could say that I wasn't from there. And I experienced that also when I went to the UAE. People would assume that I was from these various places, and then I would open my mouth and it would be like, wait, yeah, America? And yes. And so what I found is that while I think diasporans, we are connected and we are united, that there is something to be that's nuanced about navigating the abroad space as an American, because we do have American privilege. That is a thing that we have, but we don't have racial privilege. So it's almost like you're for me, it was people assumed where I was from. And then when I opened my mouth, and then when I would interact with this American swag, which is different from Kenyan swag, which is different from Ghanaian swag, it was surprising. And Detroit swag is very different. And so my
Yes.
level of directness, my level of, I mean, I'm very much assertive in my belief systems and how I say things. And so I think that it was really real. I was like, this is, my experiences are different. So I created the group for us to begin to explore the nuances of having American privilege, right? But also being Black with that privilege, and having passport privilege and what that is. And it was very new for Black Americans to experience any level, some of us, of privilege per se, and really understanding how we could then use that privilege to help someone else. And so how can we not take, we understand what colonization is and how it impacts us. And so how can we use this passport privilege that I do think our ancestors earned, right? How can we use it to make sure that we don't become what we don't like? How do we make sure that we don't become the people that are now using the privilege to subjugate and not help? So I created the space for us to have these conversations. And some of the places where we live, for me, I will say there were times when my soul was stirred. My ancestors were enslaved. And so if I navigate spaces and places and go to countries where I see things like people not being treated right, or people not being paid properly, or people, all of those things are soul stirring. And so how can we have the conversations with each other about these things as we navigate these different countries abroad? And I'm not talking any specific country. Every single country I've lived in and have visited, I see some aspects of what I believe my ancestors went through. And so it is soul stirring. And so how do I make sure that I don't become those same people who did what they did to my ancestors? So I think that space really initiated some very interesting conversations. And we also helped each other find countries that fit for us. Some people can't live in Sierra Leone, and other people, we're Western. That's our reality. We are Western people. And so you may not be able to live in Sierra Leone because of these particular things, but you might be able to live in some other space. And so I think while there are a lot of groups out there now, I think BALA really set the stage and for us to start having these conversations about moving abroad and existing abroad. And one thing I can say about Black Americans living abroad, we have been contacted by major networks in the past, and I say no. And I say no on purpose. And that's another conversation for another day. But we don't exist for popularity. We exist for expatriates and repatriates and all the people who really are part of this discussion about maintaining lives abroad and what happens when you do have to come home. So yes, that's Black Americans living abroad. That's who we are. And yeah, that's been a beautiful journey. That's been a beautiful journey.
And I think for you, you want to maintain one of your favorite words, authenticity. You want to maintain the authenticity of that group.
Yeah.
And not have it be co-opted in any way by any entity. But I will say this, living abroad, the one thing that living abroad has done for me, it's broadened my perspective in terms of what privilege and positionality are. I didn't really fully understand or grasp it when I was still in the States. Because when you're in the States, you're looking at it primarily through the lens of race. You're not really considering these other identity markers. But then you go abroad, Now you have to look at the fact that you can speak English, something that we take for granted stateside.
And it's
You
not
have
even just,
fluency in English.
it's right. It's not just speaking English, it's accent privilege,
The
right?
accent
And
too, exactly.
we have to acknowledge those privileges. And
Mm-hmm.
while I can say that I absolutely loved and enjoyed being in the UAE, the beautiful Emirati friends that I have, my ex-husband, who's Sierra Leone, yes, okay, by the way, this is a caveat. Let me digress for a minute because people are like, wait, the what husband? Listen, I always say that I can get married, but staying married has not been my wheelhouse. And so it's just hasn't been a thing for me. Okay. So yes, two husbands. So with that, my Sierra Leone, who's a beautiful soul as well, he did not have a great experience in the UAE. You know why? He didn't have passport privilege. He didn't have accent privilege. He didn't have all of the privileges that come with being American. And so I had to use my privileges at times to navigate for him. I'm not saying that people from Sierra Leone don't do well in the UAE, but there are privileges in places and spaces that they won't have. And so that's the reality. And that's not just the reality of the UAE. That's kind of a global reality, right? That we have to deconstruct. So it's not the UAE is a bad place. This is the same in America. This is the same in so many different countries. So we have to recognize
Yeah.
that.
And I also think because of how America is in terms of their restrictions for visa and travel, that's what's spread all over other parts of the globe. They're pretty much just replicating what happens in America.
Yeah, a lot
So
of places. Yeah,
we
I,
can't get
I
mad when they give us a hard time. So I try to look at it from that perspective as much as possible.
Now, I will have to say this for the UAE. What I did find that was something that I can say is beautiful is that they do allow visas from a lot of countries that America will give a harder time to, right?
Mm,
And
I've
I
heard that.
do know and have seen people from a lot of different countries, including African countries, that have done well for themselves. So again, what I say is experience, and I love, as part of what I do, I want people to not walk away and if they agree or disagree through the lens of stereotyping, right? I'm talking about my ex-husband's experience, and I don't want that to be the experience. I just want you to take it as, it is what it is. But that was his experience. He was like, this place, I mean, it's cool, but he had some difficulties with people that I just didn't have, because once I opened my mouth, people reacted differently. Also because of what I did. I'm an educator. People honor educators in a lot of different places. If you're a leader in education, they honor that. He couldn't say that. And so that's a privilege that I had as well, just being an education professional.
Yeah. And that's something that definitely holds true. So
Hmm.
I want to transition to the language segment, because one thing I know about you is you're very particular about terms. And to a certain degree, I am. I believe that there are a lot of terms out there in this highly politicized era that have been either co-opted or weaponized in some shape or fashion. And one of these terms that we want to talk about and unpack today is the term DEI, and also the many iterations of DEI. I don't care how you rearrange the letters. I don't care what order they're in. We talk about the same thing. So let's start with that. Now, your perspective on DEI. Why do you believe it's a term that is damaging when it comes to creating inclusive environments in schools? What's your thoughts on
Okay.
that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that the term itself is damaging. I think that first of all, DEI, DEIJ, EDI, IDI, ID, all like you said, all of the iterations.
Yes.
I think what we have done is we've created an acronym of very different things, right? And so very different actions, if you will. And so what people now can do, because this entity doesn't have a clear definition, so people can easily say things like the DEI hire. That makes no sense. Or I'm doing DEIJ work. What does that really mean? When you unpack it, are you doing diversity? So are you creating environments that are more diverse? Are you actually creating interventions, equity interventions, because you have determined through data that your demographic is inequitable? So your organization that you're in, are you creating environments of inclusivity? Now, to create environments of inclusivity, you do have to look at the equity within your environment. Does the environment necessarily have to be diverse? Well, it depends on where you are. If you're in a homogenous country, that, like, I worked in South Korea, that's a homogenous country. So to diversify racially, it may not make any sense. However, they could look at things like gender diversity in the particular organization. Going back to justice, a lot of people spend a lot of time arguing about whether to drop the J, keep the J, and that's because they contextualize justice as people marching or carrying signs, and not really looking at the justice as a way to change, right? And so, and then now we have belonging, and belonging means for a lot of us that it is equitable, it is inclusive. Does it have to be diverse for people to belong? Not necessarily. Do people have to see themselves and be able to show up as their authentic selves to belong? Absolutely. But we'll talk about what authentic self means as well. And so we have to stop using this DEIJB, as one term, because then you will have people in your organization, oh, they're doing that DEIJB stuff. They're doing what? It makes no sense. What everybody in an organization needs to understand is that two things I think are very important. One, that whatever we do within the realm of creating equity interventions or trying to perpetuate inclusive environments, means that they are a part of it and they are an important piece of it, and that our goal is not to necessarily it's to make sure that they feel a part of this thing that we're doing, right? Will people always agree? No. That's part of change management. Everybody's not going to agree, but we really need to start having a rationale for what we're doing. And so when we say things like we're doing, like I said to you earlier, the work, what is the work? That makes no sense. I mean, not to say that people who are saying it aren't sensible, but what I'm saying is we begin to perpetuate the thing that we don't like. So when we call it the work, it becomes ambiguous, just like DEI becomes ambiguous, and all of the things that are part of this umbrella term become ambiguous. And so in my particular organization, I tell people, let's call what it is we're doing what it is we're doing. So if we're reinforcing diversity, or we are really looking at ensuring that we have diverse environments, then let's say that that's what we're doing. If we're creating equitable environments, if we're using data to drive equitable interventions, let's say that. If we are really, really honing in on ensuring that the people within our organization feel a part of this organization and feel included, and that we are not marginalizing members of our community, let's say that that's what we're doing. If we're building communities of belonging, which is what we're doing in my organization, let's say that. Again, the justice, we really have to be careful about how our applications of justice. So in the wider global world, there are so many things that are happening that as individuals, we cannot control. As collectives, we absolutely can control. But we really have to look at the avenues of change, right? What avenue will change this particular thing? If we
Mm-hmm.
are doing things within our organization, so for instance, I can take this cup and I can put a sticker on it for whatever it is I want the sticker to say, and I can say, well, that's justice. It is absolutely not. It is performative. And so what we're starting to do is argue about whether or not I can put this sticker on my cup and bring it to work, as opposed to teaching our young people how change actually manifests itself. This is not the manifestation of change. The manifestation of change is actually not in these smaller performative acts, but it's actually getting out there. So for me, justice is for my students to look at first what's happening in the school. What is happening in the school that really we can as a cohort impact? And then if we want to go into the larger world, so at my organization, we have, or the organization that I work at, we have our students for 15 years have been really organized around human trafficking and going to Washington, D.C., right? And learning how to speak to senators and representatives. That's justice, right?
Yes.
And so if we see things happening in the globe that we want to change, we really have to have the conversation of how can our young people change it? Can they change it by wearing a t-shirt at school? Does that really enact change, or does it show that I'm in alignment with? And you can show that you're in alignment with something. There are places and spaces, and some schools say you can show that alignment here at the school or at the organization. Other organizations say you can't. If I'm told that I can't put a sticker on my cup, will that stop me from enacting and doing the things that are going to bring about change? No. Is that going to stop me from going to the Capitol and doing the things I need to do? No.
There you go.
And so I think when we talk about justice, for a lot of organizations, it's a scary thing, because people, instead of really trying to enact change and really make sacrifices, because to enact change requires sacrifice, right? It may or may not require a sacrifice. So we really, again, have to start engaging in the practices. I always like to tell this story. I sat under Dick Gregory. There were some things happening at Michigan State and we wanted change. And 30 years later, without telling the story, all the things we fought for in the 90s, they are building what we fought for back then. Dick Gregory visited us. And the first thing Dick Gregory said, everybody knows Dick Gregory was a comedian. So he started with, why do you go here? Why are you at Michigan State? And we were like, what do you think? He was like, you're not at an HBCU. And we were like, okay, the shade. And then he really talked about what it takes and what is required to make change, right? And so that's been ingrained in my spirit, and that's why DEIJB as a thing, as an entity, for opponents and proponents, we got to really start talking about and breaking down and deconstructing what it is we're doing for these organizations. And what I do within my organization, to be honest, within the realm of my organization, may not be the same as what I do outside of my organization in terms of enacting change, because it looks different.
That's right.
It really, really looks different. So that's why I don't use DEIJB. I use exactly what we're doing. And I use each particular term separately. I do want to say this before we move on. For me, what is most important is, do you matter? Belonging is one thing, inclusion is one thing, right? Mattering means that when I leave this organization for a day, for a week, forever, people remember the impact that I had. They remember me as a human being. They refer to me. They miss me. They ask me if I'm okay, if I've been out 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a day. And so that's what we really want to move. I want our organization where people not only feel like I'm a part of this community because I'm here, but when I'm gone, people miss me and I matter. So that's my hope and dream for the organization in which I work in.
Hi friends, it's me, Thaddeus from Thaddeus Nature Notebook. Are you loving our journey into the wild and learning all about awesome animals? Then don't forget to subscribe. You can find Thaddeus Nature Notebook on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Just hit that subscribe button and never miss a new episode. And if you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and leave a comment about your favorite animal. Thanks for listening and exploring nature with me. Let's keep discovering together. Now back to my daddy's self.
Right. And you're not just this expendable employee that's going to be forgotten once you're gone. You're going to be somebody who's going to be held in people's hearts because of the work you put in, but also the type of character that you displayed during your time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
and I would love for everyone to feel that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was something you mentioned about the work, and I'm so glad you broke it down. Thank you so much. Because now that I'm thinking about it, when we do say the work, we're unintentionally creating a hierarchy as far as what people are doing. And the way I like to look at the work that we do in terms of affirming student identities, there's roles, there's different roles. People play different roles in this thing. You know, some are more into building capacity, building knowledge of people. Some are more into disrupting systems. Some are more into writing to elected officials. Some do their work on social media. And there's really no shade on anybody who does any of those things. I think collectively, they all help in the grand scheme of things in disrupting the systems that we're talking about that have been inequitable for historically marginalized communities. So I like the way that you said that. And then I don't think there's one term that's all encompassing of the work that we're describing. You can't think of one term that does just that. Because when you say DEIJ, you give people the license to kind of pick and choose which letter they want to do more of. Like, I want to do the diversity. If I do diversity, I've met the mark for the other 3 letters. I want to do inclusion, which is not how it's supposed to go.
And it's not, inclusion is not diversity. Diversity is not necessarily inclusion, equity. And so we really have to get away from that. But I do want to talk about, because I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying about, and I'm going to keep using these people, right? The people who are like,
for those who are watching, yes.
Sometimes those people are your disruptors, and they are doing it for provocation, right? They want to provoke thought. And it is appropriate in certain circumstances. But what those people have to understand is, when I do these things and I'm not disrupting a system. I'm disrupting, I'm provoking. Okay. Not even disrupting. That's provocation. I'm not disrupting, I'm provoking. And so when we provoke, we really have to provoke. And this is, again, sitting under Dick Gregory. When we provoke, we have to provoke with a plan. So if you're going to provoke, what is your purpose? Are you centering yourself? Are you centering yourself to look like someone who is courageous? Or are you provoking that's going to begin the pathway to change? Because ultimately, if you look at, and if you've studied under any of the great leaders who have actually been able to successfully initiate change, if you go to the King Center and you study under what King has done, there was nothing done randomly. So if you're provoking randomly, then it's really not in line with how change had happened before. Now you can be somebody who's like, well, I'm going to do it a new way. Absolutely. I'm down with that too. But what is your plan? Nothing had ever, there's always, when you're talking about strategic change, it's strategy. It's not random. It's definitely not random. And so if you're provoking just to provoke, then really, if you're provoking just to provoke without a plan, who are you censoring and what are you censoring? And that's always my question. And it's not a question to come to the conclusion of somebody being right or wrong. It's what is your purpose? What is your purpose? Who is going to be impacted? And does whatever it is, this thing you're doing, the sticker that you're putting on, this t-shirt that you're wearing, is it going to enact change? And what change will it enact? So I wanted to get back to that because I don't want people to believe that there is not a place for provocation. Yes, there is a place for provocation, but it has to be purposeful provocation. Otherwise, you're centering yourself, and we have to be careful of that.
And that's a slippery slope because you could wear a shirt and that could easily be performative if what we're describing isn't following you wearing that shirt, or if there's no action or plan in place. And then one thing to add before we move on to the next thing is when we think about radicalism, right? We always hear about some of our greatest ancestors and leaders who are radical, whether we're talking about Detroit Red, Malcolm X, and many others. Yeah, they were radical, but they also were strategic. They didn't just go willy-nilly and just say whatever. They were very thoughtful in how they said it, very intentional about how they went about leading, how they went about moving in different. There was still a strategy that was coupled with the radicalism. And I think what tends to happen is people see the word radicalism as like, you know what, I'm just going to provoke without any plan. And that's not exactly how that's supposed to go. So I wanted to make sure I qualify what you're saying by sharing that.
Yes. And I also want us to look at when we talk about the greats like Malcolm X and anyone who has really been a part of any change movement, right? And I don't want to, Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X us to death, because that's kind of what we do. But I want to also talk about, because we one-dimensionalized Malcolm X. We one-dimensionalized Dr. Martin Luther King. So I want to challenge the audience to really look at the way that and I'm just going to, let's say Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King, because they always are seen as these polar opposites. But I really I challenge the audience to really study these folks as multidimensional individuals and watch how they moved over the course of time, because they were not the same in their death as they were when they started, right? So when you start looking at Malcolm X, the beginnings of Malcolm X and who he was and who he came to be, and the same with Dr. Martin Luther King. And so because I've studied them both for very different reasons, but we really have to stop one-dimensionalizing them in their humanity and who they were and how they went about trying to enact change.
Yeah, for sure. Because there's so much to talk about with that, but we don't have the time, unfortunately.
No, not today.
So before we wrap things up, I do want to make sure that we talk about your family, because just you as a mama, 3 beautiful children. You have your oldest, Malik, who's at your alma mater right now. So shout out to him. Musa, who we're gonna talk about.
Yeah,
because he's a superstar out here. I always love we share the stories about him. And then your daughter Mira. So you have 3 beautiful children. So we'll make sure we acknowledge that. And I want to give you a chance to just talk about Musa for a second, because you've been very open about your journey being a mother of a neurodivergent child. And in the case of Musa, 3 superpowers. We talking dysgraphia, dyslexia, ADHD. Triple
Yes.
threat right there.
Triple threat.
And the way you affirm this young Black king is so powerful, because one thing that I've come to realize, and I got to get John over here, Springer. So
Yes,
John, if you
gotta get
listening, man,
John
you got to
Springer
come
on the
on.
number.
I've been trying to get him on here, but we're going to make it happen 2025.
Yes, you
One thing,
must.
one thing I've come to realize about special education and just the idea of neurodiversity in the international school ecosystem is that it's still a work in progress.
It
There have been
is.
some gains. There's more awareness, but depending on what country you're in, what school you're enrolling your children, they may not have the requisite resources
Mhm.
necessary to serve your children or
Yep.
to put them in the least restrictive environment, as we say in the
Mhm.
States, right?
Mhm.
So I want to just give you a chance to share a little bit about your experience as a mother, but also get your thoughts on how you would assess how things are going in that arena.
Thank you for that. So I need to say one thing. I have an older daughter. Her name is Milani. I have four.
Shout out to Milani. All right.
Because
We ain't
I
gonna leave
never talk
nobody
about
out. We want to
Milani.
get everybody, get the
I
whole
don't, I don't
family.
talk, I don't talk about Milani, but I did have to shout her out.
Yes, please.
Because she is the, um, she has been the blueprint
Mhm.
for the rest of my babies. So um, I'm thankful to all of the people, and in this conversation we really didn't have time to explore my journey of identity and learning to interact with people of other races, and especially in creating these positive school culture environments, how we do have to work together, right, beyond our race and beyond our nationality and beyond our culture. And I say this because John Springer, the founder of Parents Alliance for Inclusion, has been such an inspiration to me as I navigate trying to figure out what was impeding my son from progressing at the rate that of his peers. And notice my language there, because that's very important.
That's
I
right.
didn't say I was trying to find out what was wrong with my child, because
Mhm.
there's nothing wrong with him. I just was trying to find out, listen, he's not doing things at this particular rate. And so for me, I will say that his first international school in South Korea did a wonderful job. It was so funny. We didn't get him tested, and because he was so young at the time, and it was very difficult in South Korea at the time. He was 4 years old, and his teacher was like, "Listen, it was so many things that she did to help him and for us to figure out, because he also, my son, we're looking at some issues with his speech as well. He speaks very loudly, and so we were trying to figure out if he was deaf, and she was like, "Well, I stood behind him, and I said his name, so he's not deaf." And we were just trying to figure out all of these things, some of his social impediments as well. The beauty of being in an international school and not being limited by the laws of America. Luckily, I
Mhm.
wasn't in America at the time, but the laws of public school that says that you can't do any strategies unless the child has a diagnosis, or you can't do anything specific, and they did. I'm shout out to the teachers in the schools who really, really worked with me. And I appreciate them. Where I work now has done an amazing job with my son, and really, really, again, working with him to really close some of those gaps. And I'm going to put that aside. Those two schools are unicorns within the international school system, because a lot of the schools are pride themselves on test scores. You'll see it all over. We have IB test scores of 40, and our students go to Yale, Harvard, and blah blah blah. So a baby like mine, they would discriminate against, because academically he wouldn't be good enough for them. And so if we're talking about 21st century, creating spaces for 21st century human beings, everybody's not going to Harvard. Everybody's not going to be labeled gifted. Everybody is not going to be these academic superstars, but they're going to be superstars in their own right. And so I want to
Right.
say, I'm going to, because I'm verbose, I admittedly so I'm going to tell this story, and I'm going to look at my clock and make sure it's under 3 minutes. With my sons, with all of with his superpowers. The beauty is, we were in London this summer, and my son studies rocks. And we were at a fair, and the lady was selling these bracelets and earrings, and they all had these rocks. So my son is having this conversation with a Londoner. She said that that's where she was from, and he's like, "This is this kind of rock, and that kind of rock is found in blah 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 blah, and this is this kind of rock, and then if you go to this particular place, you find, and this is this kind of rock." And her husband and I just sat back and watched them have this long conversation about these variations of rocks. And in that moment, I realized that my son has superpowers, and that these things that might be stopping him from being an active, the greatest reader, right? Or the things that stop him from holding his attention, like his ADHD, but he does have attention, right? Something does hold his attention, because he was able to talk to this woman about rocks, and she was much older than he. And so I really want we have to change the international school ecosystem, so that we're creating students who can navigate within our 21st century world, which is not just the Harvard kiddos. And it's not just the Yale kiddos, and it's not just the Oxford and Cambridge kiddos. How can we bring out the best in every single student, so that they can look back on their international school experience and say, you know what, it was because of the teachers here that I'm able to. These teachers facilitated greatness in me. These teachers, going back to what I said in the beginning, these teachers didn't tell me who I could be. They helped me find out what I could be and who I could be. And so, and not that teacher told me I couldn't. And so I say all this to say that we have to change the ecosystem, and the international schools have to begin to open their doors to all types of students, and not create these limitations for students, or not finding ways to close doors. I think international schools sometimes create more ways to close doors than to open them. And we have to now begin, if we're creating the next global leaders, and that's what we want, then we want people who are door openers, who are like, okay, this door is closed. Let me help you open this door. And so the ecosystem has to change.
Right, because you can't speak about inclusion if you have a highly selective enrollment process that does not allow for neurodiverse students to be a part of your community. And that happens a lot in a lot of international schools. They operate a lot like charter schools back in the States, where there's really no jurisdiction that's watching over them. So they have a lot of power to pick and choose, and also manipulate data points to make it appear as if they are high performing. And you do see a lot of that in a lot of international schools. Not all, but there's a good number that are still engaging in those actions. So we definitely need to put a halt to all that and
Well,
start moving forward.
what we need to do is schools like there are schools that model the International School of Brussels. I think, if I'm not mistaken, is one of those schools that really are starting to model. We take students wherever they are, right? And we create greatness in those schools. And I do have to shout out my school. I'm going to. I've said my organization the entire time, because I do, like I told you in the beginning, I draw these lines. I do draw these lines like this.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say that I think that Atlanta International School has done a fabulous job with. We do have an application process, but it's not about the students' academics. Right. And I will say the school that my children went to, North London Collegiate School in South Korea, which is a school that prides itself on all the things that we talked about, but they also took care of my baby. They did. And I can't, I'd be remiss if I pretended like they didn't. They really did a good job with my son. And I'm going to be honest, his ADHD caused him to do some very interesting things as a young kiddo, and they didn't penalize him for being neurodiverse. And we have to be careful of that. Are we penalizing students? Again, closing doors or opening them. That's the choice a lot of these schools are making, and they're more door closers than door openers.
Yes, but that gives us a reason to continue to do the different kind of work that we do in order to transform that and make it better for all of our students.
Yeah.
Trina, I appreciate our I appreciate your story. I know we didn't get to everything, but trust me when I say that I spent hours just kind of looking through old posts and everything. I said you are amazing, like everything that you do, and I appreciate you for taking time to share a little bit about your story today. But I want to finish off with one last question. It's the one that I always love to share with folks. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
Oh, it's so hard when I'm not in the classroom. I haven't been in a classroom for a while. And there are
You're a
times that I
teacher
would
at heart
say,
still,
well, I was
regardless
getting
of
ready
what
to
you
say
do.
this. Yep, I was getting ready to say this. Even though I don't have those individual relationships with students, what I do for Black Americans living abroad, that was teaching, right? Anybody who had any questions about living abroad and still do, that's teaching. Anytime I go into a space and I share knowledge, I'm teaching. And so the teacher in me will always be. And I just, at the end, right? At the end, at the very end, when my life is kalas or the full stop or a
Mhm.
period, um, I want to be able to say that I taught someone, somewhere, something. That's it.
All right,
That's it. So,
there it is, y'all. And then, of course, if people want to connect with you online, how can they do that on social media or whatever platform you want to direct them to? 'Cause I know
yeah,
you're
okay. Yes. Okay. So LinkedIn, Katrina Daniels-Samasa, and then Instagram is Black Americans Living Abroad. And so those are the places that you can follow me.
all right, y'all. So you heard it from Katrina. Make sure you connect with her. Make sure you follow her because she puts out good stuff. She really does. And this is how I know that you're a real one because when people say they engage in the work that we engage in or in that realm, they put out the romanticized stuff. But no, you put out times when you may have fallen short. You put out times where you may have had to apologize to somebody. Not everybody does that. So you have the balance, and that's what I appreciate about you, and I thank you for doing that, for modeling that to other people.
And thank you for inviting me. And at the end of the day, we are all human beings who err. And, it's about acknowledging that we err and trying to repair the damage and, learning, right? And so thank you so much. And I appreciate you and the work that, these podcasts are bringing on some really interesting people who I think we all can learn from. So I appreciate you. And again, I stay away from the work that you do, but the books and the podcast and really impacting educators around the world. I appreciate that from you.
Thank you. And on behalf of Katrina, wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.